Hi and welcome to another QwikTouchPro video. This is going to be our third video in our series of using QwikTouchPro and Keystroke to build a kiosk. And in our previous video we created this kiosk sales screen, which is a scrolling list of inventory items that the customer can touch to add the items to their invoice or to their cart. And then there's a list of departments down the left side that they were able to filter off of. And in this video then we're going to do the next template, which is when the customer clicks checkout, we're going to go to another template where they can review and edit their order before moving on to the payment screen. So let's get started by creating a new template. And I'm going to create this just like we did in the previous templates. And this is explained in the first video in this series, so we're just going to go through it pretty quickly. It's 1080 by 1920 or 10.8 by 19.2. We're going to do window mode. We want to lock the width, set the height at 100%, and right justify. Say OK. And let's go ahead and save this template as kiosk _ review order. Save. And let's see, what do we want in this template? If we look back at our sales screen, there's a lot of this information that I want. Like I would take this, the list of how many items we have, what the current subtotal is, cancel button, the checkout button, all this stuff at the top. So to get that, we can just copy all this from this template to the next one. And I'm just going to select all these by holding down the control key. And there's not very many items. I'm going to select them all individually. And when I'm copying large numbers of controls like this, where I want to maintain their position, I group them first with Control G, and then I'll hit Control C to copy. Go into our review order screen. I'm just going to right click and paste in here, and all our controls are going to come in laid out just like they were. So let's ungroup all of that now, and let's come back in here. I'm going to ungroup this as well, just so we don't forget. Come back into here, and now let's change some text here. Instead of add items, this is going to say probably review order. You need to make that text just a little bigger. Zoom in, pan around. So review order, let's save that. Probably need to go under template and change our background color from transparent to something white. Now if we preview our template now, we have everything, review order. This is already wired up. If we were to clerk into keystroke and add an inventory item, all of these labels down here at the bottom work. If we hit cancel, we're going to clear our transaction and go back to the start of our template. So by copying all that stuff over, just saved us a lot of work, I guess is all. So next thing we want to do on the review order screen, we want this to be a big scrolling list of items that are on the keystroke sales invoice. So let's add a couple items here. And maybe a couple more clocks. So we want the customer to be able to see that they have 3 clocks and a Bic pen and a short sleeve cotton shirt, and then be able to come down and edit those items. So we're going to do that through a data view using the data port again. But like we've done in the previous videos, we're just going to lay that out on this template first. So let's start with some plain text. And let's go back to keystroke for a second. What we're going to want to display is probably the description, the quantity, how many they have on their invoice right now, and we'll probably just do the amount, which is price times quantity. So let's go back in. So this first one's going to be description. I'll make it a little wider. Let's zoom in where we can get to this. Oops. And I'm just going to move this over and size it to whatever I think is a good size. Probably left justify description. Let's make a copy of that. This one's going to be amount or amount due, and we'll center that. It doesn't need to be that big. This is going to say something like $9.99, so we can size that out. All right. I'm going to select both of these and move them over. So next thing we want, so this is, we got the description, we're going to have the amount due. We're going to want the quantity, but we're going to put that inside of a little spinner, like a little plus minus spinner that the customer can click up and down to adjust the quantity. So to do that, we're going to create a little spinner button. So let's put a border on here with plain text on it. And I'm going to group both of those into a button. And we're going to have one of these, actually change let's go for 0 radius to make the button square, just to kind of keep the theme I've got going on here. So this first button is going to be a minus button. And then we're going to copy and paste that. Let's copy and paste that. This is going to be the quantity, so we'll make that 0. And it's going to copy a couple more of those. We're going to need a plus button. And this last button is going to say something like updates. All right, so we can make that text a little smaller. Make the font a little bigger on the plus minus buttons. Let's see, this button is going to say, maybe 99 or something. So how big? We could probably make that a little bigger. Yeah. All right, so let's move these down over here. See if we're going to have room for all of this yet. Yeah, looks like we're good spot so far. So I'm going to add a little color to these buttons now. And in a previous video, we created this color palette custom control, which has all of our colors on it. So we can come in and make our update button now. Let's make that green with what, probably white text. I'm going to make both of these buttons. Let's make them the light gray, I guess. Yeah, and we'll make the font color on these probably the dark gray instead of black. I could have selected both of these and made those the dark gray as well. All right, so I think we can delete that. So this is kind of what our control is going to look like here. And we're going to have one of these for every item on our inventory or on our sales screen. So I think we're ready now to make a template out of this, or an item template out of this. So I'm going to Control G for group. And again, what we're doing is laying this out on this template so we know how big we can make it. And we know now that the width is going to be 1050 and a height of 100. So let's just copy that. Create a new template now, and we need the height of 10, or the width of 10.5 it looks like, and a height of 1. All right, that's right. Let's hit OK, paste that in, and see how our stuff fits here. Perfect, and fits perfectly, so we're going to save that. And let's call this let's call this review order item template. And that's saved. Let's just come back in here and delete this now. And let's add our data view. And we drag a data view onto the canvas. For data source, we're going to want our keystroke data port, which we set up in a previous video. So I'm going to select that. And that's going to be, when we select the data port for data view, we're going to get all of these line items. So the 3 line items we have in this case. Back into QwikTouchPro, and we need a template to represent each item on the list, which is this iReview order item template we just created. This one we're going to scroll vertically as well, and I think that's it. Let's just hit OK and zoom in and see where we're at. So I'm going to nudge this around with the control key. I'm actually going to center this. I'm going to highlight the border, which is already centered, or this big black background. Then I'm going to hold down Control and select my inventory list, or my data view, and then under, what is it, layout, align centers. Let's just preview this and see where we're at. So we have a list of all our items. If we add an item to the sales screen, it should show up on our list, and I'd probably scroll back over here. We probably didn't make our list tall enough here. Scroll down. Let's make this go all the way to the top and the bottom of the screen. There we go. Save that. Let's preview that again. So now we'll see all our items, and again, if we add an item here, we'll see it automatically pops up on the list. We haven't bound our data or our buttons yet, but all our items are showing up on there. So for our next thing, let's go ahead and wire up these buttons. Let's change description to actually show the description and the price and all of that. So let's go back into QwikTouchPro. And I'm also going to, I want a little space between each one of these. I don't like those all right up next to each other. So let's do that. Go back in here. And the way I'm going to do that is, instead of resizing these controls, I'm going to resize the template. Go under Template Properties. And we want to make it just a little taller. I want it 1 taller in each direction. So instead of 1, I'm going to just make it 1.2. That. And now if we put that Control down arrow, you're going to see that gets us back into the center of our template. And when we refresh this now, let's pan up. So now when I refresh my template, we should see that we have a little bit of space between each one of those. So let's go back over here. I think let's ungroup those. Well, that's fine. So let's go back under data and let's just bind these up. So we're going to go to the data port. And this is going to be a line item that we're binding this to. Again, the data port's kind of unique that it has 2 different data sources at the same time. It's got information about the invoice, like the customer, the number, the date, the total amount due. But then it also has this collection of items that are actually on the sales invoice. And that's what we're going to bind to in this data view. So let's go back in. And how we do that is with data port selected, if you go down to the bottom of this list, there's a bunch of items that start with line item. And these are all of our line item items. Line item options, I guess we could say. So we want line item description. I'm going to hit apply. This is line item price extension or something. Price extension shipped probably. Oops. Where'd we go? Line item price extension shipped. And that's going to be a dollar amount, so we'll format that with our string format currency. I'm going to ungroup this. We want this to be our quantity. I'm going to name this one TXTQTY, and then we'll go up and bind it to line item. It's probably quantity shipped, I think. Let's hit apply, save that, go back into our view order. Now, if I refresh our template here, we're not going to see any of those items bound up. If we preview the template, we'll see them. And we can see now that we have the clock, the pen, our inventory, our quantity on hand lines up, our amount due is all, everything's where it needs to be. So let's go back into the editor. And what's happening here is essentially we just can't bind, we can't preview line item bindings in the editor is what I'm trying to say here, I guess. So there's a little shortcut or a trick we can do here to see at least some of this. If we go back into our order template and line item description under data. Now I said at the beginning of this video that we want to use all the ones that are started with a line item in this case. But we can go up to description in this case, which is under the D's. And if we bind this to description instead of line item description, because they both have the same name, it's just kind of coincidentally going to work here. This isn't a feature as much as just kind of a workaround, I guess. To refresh that now, at least we'll be able to see the description on our list. And again, it shows up fine when we preview the items. Or preview our template. So I think the next thing we want to do is when we click this plus minus button, we want to increment this value, whatever value is in that box. So let's go back into our editor. And to do that, let's start with the plus button. I'm going to double click the plus button to go into its macro editor. And when I click on this button, I want to change, here, let's back up a second here. Let's set this back to a number so we can see what's going on. When I hit the plus button, I want to increment whatever value is in this box by 1. So if I hit it now, it's going to be 1 and then 2, etc., etc. So when we click the plus button, we want to change the text of this box. So that's under text, change text. And we named that txt quantity, and I renamed controls that I'm going to refer to, just so you don't have to try to figure out if it's text 14 or plain text 13 or whatever. So we're going to call it txt quantity, and we want to set the text of this to be whatever the text is now, and we're going to get that through the source control builder. So we're going to say text, txt quantity text. So we're going to, when we click the plus button, we want to set the text of this button to whatever it is now plus 1. And then we need to come down here and put a check in this box that says calculation that lets QwikTouchPro know that we don't want to see the text plus 1. We actually want to add 1 to whatever this number is in this box. And I think that's it. Let's just close that, save that, and come back in and preview this. And if we hit the plus button now, we should see our numbers increment. And they don't end. What's happening here, notice when we click on this, this entire row is getting selected, just like it did with the inventory list or the department list. Each item on here acts as one big button. So we need to change that. Let's go back into the editor. And we're going to change that. Let's hit our data view. Let's rename this DV, what is this, review order, let's say. We're going to right click on this, choose configure data view. And again, we need to change our selection mode. We're on click selection mode right now, which means every row in this data view acts as a button. And we want to change it down here to none. And by doing that, let's just save that and preview that. So now when I touch the row, nothing happens. But now I can get in and actually click on the buttons inside the canvas or inside the item template. By setting the selection mode to none, we're enabling all of these controls inside the template. So anyway, so we set selection mode to none, and now we can go in and add the quantities or update the quantities on these buttons. So let's go back in. So now let's do the minus button, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to right click on the plus button and copy. I'm going to right click the minus button and choose paste macros, and that's going to replace all the macros on this key, which there aren't any yet, with whatever macros there were on this key. And now if we go into the macro editor, instead of having to recreate all that, I can just come under change text, edit, and instead of +1, this one's going to be -1. And there's one more thing we want to do here. We don't want the customer to be able to choose a negative amount. If they come on this invoice and or come to this screen and they have 3 items, we don't want them to go below 0 to be able to, refund an item or something like that. So we're going to put a condition on here that says, let's go to conditions. We're going to say if this text, so we're going to go out to text txt quantity. If the text in txt quantity is greater than 0, then it's okay to decrement that number. So let's hit update. So when we hit the minus button, we're going to change the value of this box to whatever it is now, -1, as long as that value is greater than 0. So let's just save that. We can here preview this. See what we're doing. So now we can hit minus all the way down to 0, but we can't go beyond. And then of course we could hit plus for as many items as we want. So the next thing we want to do here is when I'm updating this button, let's have this amount due update with it. So if I hit 0, this really should say 0 now. So the customer knows what they're getting into, I guess, with what they're purchasing there. So let's go back into QwikTouchPro, back into here. And what we need to do now is let's change some of these back to some prices so we can kind of see what's happening here. All right, so when we hit the plus button here, we want to increment this by 1, but then we always want to line up our label here, and let's just call this txt amount so we can remember what it is. So we need to know when we update this quantity, we want to make sure that we always update this text amount, which is going to be the price times the quantity. So we need to add the price to this template. So let's just copy, let's start with our amount due, and we're going to data bind this instead of list price price extension. I think there is a list item price. We don't need to format that as a $sign because we're not actually going to see this. This is going to be a hidden label that we're going to use for a calculation. So let's hit apply on that. And before we hide it, let's make sure that it works. So let's preview our template, and we should see now the price of each item. Yep, so this one's $12.50, and we have 3 of them, so it's $37.50. So now when we hit the plus button, we're going to multiply this number times this number to update that label. So let's go back into QwikTouchPro. And the way we're going to do that is through a calculation data source. Whoops, I didn't get that closed. Close that. Let's go back into here. So first thing we'll do is name this label as well. So let's call this txt price. So we've got the price, we've got the amount, and we've got the quantity. Next thing we need to do, let's go ahead and create our calculation data source. So let's go under data, data sources is new, calculation, we want price, which we're going to get from another control, which is a text control, which is on this order item template, and one of these now should say text price. Yep. Say OK. And let's put a sample value in there. Let's say the price is $5.65. And hit add. And now we want the total quantity, or the quantity, let's say. So QTY, we're going to get that same way from a text control on this review order item template. This time we want txt quantity, and that's this label here. So we'll say OK. Let's put a sample value in there again. Let's say they have 3 of these, and hit add. And now to use these calculations, we just want price times quantity. So I'm going to highlight price, insert selected variable, type an asterisk, highlight quantity, insert selected variable. And now if we hit test, we should be whatever 3 times 5.65 is. 1695 sounds right to me. So we'll hit create. And let's call this for calculation. And let's call it calc amount due, or calc amount, I suppose. And hit save. Not going to add this to the current template. So now to use that value, essentially again, every time we hit the plus button or the minus button, we want to update this label with that text from the result of that calculation. And instead of wiring these up on the buttons, instead of saying when we click this button, do something, we have another option here. If I double click on, right now we have txt quantity selected. If I double click on that, under its macro events, we have an option here for text changed. So we can actually fire macros anytime this text changes. So instead of having to say, well, if the minus button does something, or if the plus button does something, we can just say if anything changes this text at all, we want to perform this action. So when the text is changed, we want to change the text of our, where's text? Change text. We want to change the text of our amount text, which is this, to be whatever the result of our calculation was. And that's going to be under, where are we at? It's going to be a data source. We're going to import our calc amount data source. We want the result is really the only value we want. These other two are just kind of for troubleshooting more complex calculations. So we want the result. And I think we want to format this as $sign, so with a 0:C action here. I think that's it. I think if we just close that and save that, come back in, preview this. We should see when we hit the plus button that our quantity or amount due updates with whatever our quantity is. If we set them all to 0, we get 0. So this should go to $7.20, $12.50. Cool. So all of that works, which means we can go in and hide this price column now. So let's do that. And we can't delete it, we're just going to hide it. So to hide it, I'm going to set the visibility to 0. And then I'm going to freeze it with this freeze control up here. And again, when we freeze a control, it makes it partially transparent or partially opaque so that it shows up a little bit. So now we know that there's a hidden control on here. And if you ever want to work with that again, you can come up here and choose thaw and thaw out txt price, which actually in our case, let's change that to, let's put a dollar amount in there again. And then let's go back and hide it and freeze it. All right, so anyway, it's frozen now. We can't click it. It's not in the way. You won't see it when you run the template, but we'll know it's there when we're building these templates. So let's save that. So I think the next thing we're going to do is when we hit the update button, we want to update our inventory or our sales invoice with whatever items they've selected. So let's just see what that's going to look like. If we go back in and log into Keystroke or clerk into Keystroke, so what we're going to do here, so they have 3 clocks on their invoice, and let's say they come up here and they hit 2 more, and they want 2 additional clocks, and they hit update. We want to add 2 clocks to this invoice. And the way we're going to do that is whatever the stock number of the clock is, which is stock number 3. So we need to know the stock number, and then you do what is, I think it's the quantity you want. So we want to add 2 times stock number 3 will give us 5 clocks. And then if we wanted to get rid of all the clocks, we could type -5 times stock number 3, and now we'll be down to 0 clocks. So we need to do the same thing in QwikTouchPro. If we want to add 2 more pens, we need to figure out what the stock number of pen is, which is, I guess, 6. And then we need to say we want 2 times stock number 6, and we'll get our pens. So let's go ahead and do that in QwikTouchPro. And the way we're going to do that is through another calculation data source, because we're going to need to calculate however many items they have on their invoice now, let's say 3 versus whatever this number is, and then figure out how many items we need to add. So let's just go back into QwikTouchPro, close that. Let's go back in here. Before we create our data source, there's another piece of information we need here. We're grabbing the quantity, so when this template loads, or when this first draws or renders on the screen, this is going to match the quantity from keystroke 3 or 0 or whatever we have here. But as soon as we start hitting the plus button, that number is going to change. So we need to have another label on here that keeps that original quantity. And I'm just going to, I think we can probably just copy the quantity button. Move it over here. It's not named the thing. When you copy it, it loses the name, so it's not, the macros aren't going to be looking for this as txt quantity. But I think we did keep the data binding. We did. And it's the same data binding we had before. We're going to, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Preview that template outside of the main template. Let's go back in, save that. Let's just go in and review our order again and preview that, make sure that works. So now that should show us our current number, current inventory, current quantity, even though we changed the plus button here, right? And it's a little hard to see, but if we went in and did, let's say, 10 baseball caps, we should see that. So now again, we know when we hit this button, if we hit 2, we want to subtract this number minus this number, and then send 2 times the stock number. And let's just go into that again. Exit that, back into QwikTouchPro. And actually, I do want to name this text now. Let's call this TXT original quantity. And we've got original quantity and the new quantity. So let's go and create another data source. That's under data. Data source is new. Calculation. We want original quantity, which we should be able to get from our text. We're going to have to import that from our iReview order item template. And there should be a text on here now for TXT original quantity. There we go. And let's set again, just a sample value, and that's just to test the calculation when we're done. Let's do that as 5. So we got the original quantity, and now we want the current quantity. So let's call this current quantity. Same thing, we're going to browse out, get that from a text control, which is on our iReview order item template, which is this template. And this one is TXT quantity. Say apply and OK. Say the new quantity is 3. They had 5 and they want 3, so we'll hit add. We want to take the current quantity, insert that, minus the original quantity, and insert that. So in our case, we had 5, and we said we want 3, so this should be -2 when we hit test, and it is, so our calculation's working. We can hit create, and let's call this calc new QTY for new quantity. Don't need to add that. So now when we hit the update button, we want to send, just like we did in keystroke here, we want to send whatever the result of that calculation, so -2 times stock number, whatever the stock number is, and then hit return. So we need the stock number on here as well. Let's go ahead and I'm going to hide and freeze this quantity label because we're done with that. We saw that it's working. And let's freeze that. And let's put another piece of plain text on here, and this is going to be TXT stock number. These are all kind of starting to walk over themselves a little bit. We could resize them. Doesn't matter how big these are. We're just using them for reference. And let's call this TXT stock number. And we're going to bind this up to the stock number of the current line item. So that'll be line item stock number probably. Stock number, hit apply. Let's put some other text in there. It's 7, so we know what that is. And if we preview this now, and again, I just want to make sure all these buttons are working. So ball cap looks like stock number 8 according to this, and that is stock number 8. So let's go back into QwikTouchPro. We've got all the information we need. We're ready to wire up the button. So we're going to go in here and double click on the update button. Actually, let's call this BTN update, and let's double click the button. And when we hit this button, we want to send the result of that calculation first. So we're going to go to Active Program, Send Text, and the text is going to be the result of that calculation. So data source, browse out to new quantity, and we want the result of the calculation, add. So we're going to send the results, add, we're going to send active program, send text, we're going to send an asterisk now, add, and then we're going to send the stock number, which is active program, send text. We're going to get the stock number from a text control, and it's on this template, so we should see it here, txt stock number, text again, hit add. So when I click the update button, we're going to send whatever the result of our calculation minus 2 times stock number. And I think we need one more. We need active program, send code return to actually execute the action. So add, close, save that, go back into review order, preview our template. Let's just see how we're doing here. So we have 1 mouse pad, and we'll have to hide these labels because they're all jumbled up there. But if we want 3 mouse pads and hit update, we can see that we send the stock number, the new quantity, and a return. So we have 0 clocks. Let's say we want 5 clocks. We've got 5. And again, we can't go below 0. So if we hit minus 3 mouse pads, we're going to be down to 0. And in a future video, we can talk about removing this item. So this item, quantity of 0, but it still shows up on the invoice, right? It hasn't disappeared on here. So the customer is going to see now that they have 0 mouse pads, whatever we'd call that. And the quantity on, we need to have that matrix item again. The quantity down here is going to show $0 and all of that. But they're going to, again, this is just a cleanup thing. We're not going to worry about it in this template or this video, but we can certainly go back and remove items off this list now that have a 0 quantity. Again, out of scope for this video. So let's just go back into QwikTouchPro, and we're going to hide that label. This is our hidden stock number, so we're going to go ahead and hide that, make it visibility 0, and then freeze it so we can see it again. And what else do we need to do on this template? Let's go back and preview this again and just see where we're at. Add a couple of items. Matrix item again. And again, we covered that in a future video. Need to make sure the items we're adding, if they're matrix items, we would need to handle that QwikTouchPro, which is out of scope of this video. So I think the next thing we're going to do, let's clear a transaction and let's add an item to it. Let's say they have 1 item on this invoice and they come in and minus and hit update, and now they have 0 items on this invoice. We want to disable the checkout button. We haven't wired this button up yet, but we will. And essentially what we're going to do, since we're not going to remove this item off the list, or I guess even if we were going to remove this item off this list, we just want to make sure that anytime their quantity is 0 or if the amount due is 0, that we gray out the checkout button. So let's go back into QwikTouchPro. And back in here, and we're going to assume that every time we come to this template, for the first time, we should assume that we have items on the invoice. So we're going to start out with the button enabled, and let's rename this. I'm going to call this BTN checkout. And what we want to do is, if our line items, if our amount due ever becomes 0, we want to disable this button, and then if it becomes 1, or if the amount due gets greater than 0, we want to re-enable the button. And the way we're going to do that is through our keystroke data port macros. If we go under data sources, manage, we have our data port on this list, and if we hit edit macros, we've got a bunch of events that fire on the data port. And these were all the checkboxes we saw when we set this up in keystroke. But one of these is line item changed, and line item change fires every time an item changes on this inventory. So if I hit the up arrow key, that would change the line item. If I add an item to it or delete an item, anything that affects the line items on this is going to cause that macro to fire. So what we're going to do is say, anytime the line item changes, we want to look to see if the current amount due is 0, we want to disable this button. And if the amount is greater than 0, we want to enable the button. So let's just get started. Line item change, we're going to go to controls, and we're going to disable a control. And we're going to disable BTN checkout, but we're going to put a condition on that that says if our data port, so data source, keystroke data port, and let's find amount due, I think is as good as any, because if the amount due is 0, there must not be any items on the invoice, nothing to pay for anyway. So we'll say OK. And we're going to disable this control if the amount due equals 0. And actually, you know what? I'm going to do less than or equal to 0. It doesn't matter. They shouldn't be able to go less than 0 here. Just to absolutely future-proof this, if somehow they did, we're going to disable the checkout button if the item is less than or equal to 0. And we also want to gray the button out a little bit, or hide the button, change the opacity just a little bit so they know it's grayed out. And we'll do that under, let's hit add first. And then we're going to go under controls, change opacity, and we're going to change the opacity of the checkout button, BTN checkout, to be maybe 0.5. Let's hit add. And then we need to do the opposite of this. We're going to go in and say we want to controls, enable control, and we're going to enable button checkout on the condition that our data port, so data source, data port, amount due is greater than 0. 0, add. And I forgot to add a condition to our change opacity. Let's go back and edit that. We only want to change the opacity to 0.5 if we don't have any items. So if our data source, data port, amount due is again less than or equal to 0, change the opacity. Let's update that. Add one more, which is controls, change opacity, and we're going to change the opacity back to 1 if the amount due, so data source, data port, amount due is greater than 0. All right, so every time the line item changes, so anytime anything happens with the invoice, essentially, we're going to disable the control and change the opacity if the item's 0, if there's no money on the or no items on the inventory, no items on the invoice. And then we'll do the opposite of that if they are. Did I get everything on here? Am I missing one? Oh, I didn't hit add yet. There we go. So disable, change, enable, change. Let's just see how that looks. I'm going to save that, preview this. Let's go back to keystroke. So the button's enabled because we have one item. If I change it to 0 now and hit update, the button's going to gray out and we can no longer click it. Of course, we can't click on it yet anyway. But if we come back and change that to 3, the button should re-enable, and it didn't. So let's go see what's happening there. Let's see. We're back under manage. Got our line items. So we're saying we disabled the control. That worked fine. Oh, I missed the let's change opacity. I didn't select BTN checkout, and you can see here I was trying to change the opacity of group 5, which is just some control we haven't even used yet or haven't named. So let's save that, preview that, try that again. Let's make sure keystroke has the focus. So if we go to 0 items, button disables. If we add 1 item, button re-enables. And there we go. So next thing we're going to do on this, let's hit cancel to clear the transaction and touch here to begin. The next thing we're going to do is wire up this button. We want this checkout button to go to our review order screen when the customer clicks on it. So let's set that up next. And do that, we're going to go to the sales screen, and I'm just going to double click the checkout button. Actually, I'm going to rename this one BTN checkout as well. BTN checkout. And double click to open up its macros, and all we want to do is QwikTouchPro show template, and we're going to browse out to this review order screen and hit add. Not going to customize it and hit close. And the next thing we want to do, though, is we kind of need the same rules on this template. We don't want them to be able to check out unless they have an item on the invoice. So when they first come to this template, this button's probably going to want to be grayed out because when they first come here from the touch here to begin screen, they won't have any items on the invoice. So let's go under home, or under controls, I'm sorry. And we have this disabled button over here. And with BTN checkout selected, I can click disabled. And now that button is disabled without having to fire a macro. It'll just start out disabled. And same thing, we can come under layout and set it at an opacity of 0.5 to make it grayed out when we start. And now we just need to re-enable that, just like we did on the other checkout button. Anytime the line item changes, if there is a line item, let's re-enable the button. And to do that, we're going to go back into here. Let's go data sources managed. So we already set all this up under our macros. When the line item changes, we run all this. So I'm just going to export this whole thing and call this M for macro export. And let's say enable checkout button. Okay. And I'm going to delete all of these now. And instead of firing them individually, we're going to go to QwikTouchPro, run macro export, and we're going to browse out and run enable checkout button and hit add. Now it's going to do the exact same thing it did the first time, but we've made that a reusable macro that we can use on our other template. So let's hit close and close. And again, under macros, if you hit edit, you can come in and see the contents of that enable checkout button. It's just what we did. It's the, check the conditions, enable or disable the button accordingly. So let's save that. Let's go back into our sales screen, and same thing, we're going to data sources manage. We're going to find our data port, edit, and we're going to say when the line item changes, we want to QwikTouchPro, run macro export, enable checkout button, hit add, and close, and save. And then we're going to preview our template. And now when we get to our screen first loads, we have no items on the inventory list, or no items on the sales invoice, so the button's grayed out. If we add a mouse pad, it should turn the button green, which it did. And we have wired up the checkout button, so now we can go into the next screen. And if we set this to 0, the button should gray out again. If we cancel, which goes back to our main screen, again, we just go through all this. As soon as we add an item, the button lights up. Let's go to checkout again. One thing we wanted to be able to do here is I want to be able to get back to the previous template without canceling this entire transaction. So we're going to add a back button here that just takes us back to this sales template. So let's toss that on real quick. Let's go back into our review order and zoom in down to the bottom here. I'm just going to copy maybe the cancel button here, and let's change background color on this to be blue maybe. And this is going to be a back button, so let's just say back. Again, we could put icons or wingdings or something on that. Let's just have it say back, I guess. And let's make it a little smaller. So it needs to be about that big. And we need to make some room for it here. So I'm going to group both of those and just slide them out of the way. Let's see here. Can we zoom in more? Pan down to the bottom. So if we resize this now, if I can get that little guy, and just put the back button here. I was going to use the nudge and tweak keys again, then to move it, get it sized back over. We'll ungroup all of this. And we'll just have the back button. We'll double click that and we'll say, so I copied the cancel button. So we have all the macros from the cancel button. So one thing I could do is I just right click on this and choose delete macros. Come back in, double click, and now we can go to QwikTouchPro, show template, and we're going to go browse out to the sales screen. And not going to customize it. Say OK, save. And now where are we at here? So we preview this. We can go back to our previous transaction or our previous screen. No items on the sales invoice. When the template loads, we automatically set the button to disabled. I think actually, is that going to work? Let's see. If we add an item, go to checkout, and we go back, the button starts off disabled because let's go back in and take a look at that. When we created this template, or when I created this template, I guess, sales screen, right? Essentially, when this template loads, we just need to enable or disable the checkout button. And we've already set most of that up, so we can go back in our macros, edit, and now it's going to load, and we're just going to do QwikTouchPro, run macro export, and we're just going to rerun this enable checkout button again, say add. And again, it's got all the logic in it. If there's an item on the invoice, it's going to add it. If there isn't, it won't. So let's save that, preview that. And now the button enables because when the template loaded, it noticed we had an item on the invoice. If we go to checkout and go back, button's still enabled, or it started off disabled and then re-enabled itself, which is fine. If we go back in, remove the item, the button disables. We go back, our button remains disabled. We can't check it, can't click on it. So what else do we have in this template? I think that might be it. Let's just walk through it again. We're going to add a couple of items. We'll be able to go to checkout. We can increase that number. I think that all looks good. So I think that's actually going to do it for this video. And in the next video, then we'll move on to the next template, which is going to be a enter payment screen where the customer is going to be able to enter a payment to complete the sale. And that's going to do it for this video. And as always, thanks for watching.